We are broadcasting live on Zoom and Facebook. This is the title of our presentation, Risk Perception and Communication in Times of Crisis, example with the COVID-19. We are going to engage with the ways in which institutions have responded to the COVID-19 in terms of advocacy. How did they communicate about it? Did they communicate in an effective way? Did they communicate in an honest way? Was their communication poor? Why is it important for you? Whether you are an advocate, whether you are not at all an advocate, whether you would like to become an advocate, these issues are important because they will have consequences intended and unintended now and in the future. Why is this important for me? It is important for me as a scholar simply because I know for a fact that this situation, that this particular crisis will be my study, in my books for the next few years. Now, I would like to introduce Guillemette. Guillemette, please join me. She's going to give you the rules of the game, and I will continue in a second.
Thank you very much, Davide. And so I'm the Senior Program Officer for the Executive Programs on Advocacy in International Affairs. And to raise any questions during this webinar, please don't hesitate to type them. You have a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. So don't hesitate to type your questions and we will be very pleased to answer them at the end of the webinar. Thank you.
Okay. Now, let's move to the contents of our presentation today. I have a preliminary question which has to do with the term, one of the key terms. We talked about the response to the COVID crisis, and of course, crisis is essential here. A crisis, the crisis, whose crisis? The ways in which institutions, NGOs, international organizations, policymakers, the private sector deal with the crisis or a crisis are very different. And we're going to give you some examples that are related to our module in international advocacy that we're going to deal in detail in our class. And of course, when we do deal with the issue of the crisis or a crisis, there are a number of risks. Risks of underplaying and risks of overstating the crisis. The question, the thread, what we would like you to take away from our presentation is, where does the advocate stand? We have selected two examples. One concerns a grassroots movement and an NGO that I'm pretty sure most of you are familiar with, Extinction Rebellion. And the other case where that we would like to compare and contrast is, of course, Greta Thunberg. And of course, this is relevant to us because in this particular case, these two institutions or this one-man show, one young woman show, Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion, did go about dealing with the COVID crisis in very different ways. As you can see in this particular slide here, Extinction Rebellion has undertaken a number of actions. I'm going to give you the examples of the actions that Extinction Rebellion has undertaken here in Switzerland. And they have done something very interesting. They have used a very, very old technique, which is the poster. And they have been putting these posters in specific places, targeting the present and the future. And so for them, the ways in which they engage with their audiences or even the lay person that really cross the street and see their posters is something that we are pretty familiar with. And of course, they have targeted certain sectors. It seems to me, and we can debate about that later on, that Extinction Rebellion has turned the page of the COVID crisis, and starting in the month of May 2020, a few days ago, it started communicated as before the crisis, but at the same time, it has integrated the crisis. So the point that I would like to make is that the technique used by this particular institution are the same, and they are unaffected by the crisis, but the discourse on the crisis has been integrated in the ways they do things. Let me give you another example. Extinction Rebellion has interpreted the crisis or has considered the crisis as a given and at the same time as a stepping stone. So for instance, if you have a look at the poster on the left-hand side of your screens, you will see that they are conducting a campaign about care and not dividends. This is an issue that is particularly important here in Switzerland for a number of reasons, and this is how they stand. So this is a clear example of how they have been dealing with the crisis and how the crisis has been, the COVID crisis has been incorporated in their discourse and in their actions. The other one is directly related to what Extinction Rebellion does. They do care about the environment, and so rebel for life, rebel for the earth, and this is in a context that already existed before COVID and makes a new sense after COVID-19. A third example, which has to do with the crisis and its consequences. This is yet another way of conducting some of the actions by Extinction Rebellion. Nous voulons un futur. We want a future. Changer le système, pas le climat. We have to change the system, not the weather. And so we do realize that this particular institution here has encompassed the different spatial and temporal dimensions of the crisis. And so it seems to me that they have skipped all the problems related to very rigid definitions of the COVID-19 crisis, and they have approached the crisis or the discourse around the COVID-19 in a using very malleable, flexible definitions. And so they have avoided catastrophism, they have avoided banalization, and they are back to their business and what they care about. So the question is, what is at stake for advocates? And it seems to me that in this particular case, they have done a very good job in terms of how they communicate, what is the purpose of their communication. Here we have yet another way in which I find their way of communicating particularly interesting. I'm referring to the poster on the left-hand side of this slide. And so through their writing on that particular advertising, on that particular poster, they are also sending a very clear message that relates to gender inequality, to the exploitation of the body of the women, but at the same time, they are conveying what matters to them. Nous voulons un futur, we want a future and a different future. Now we can compare and contrast their action with what Greta Thunberg has been doing, and I will show you in a second the Facebook page by Greta Thunberg. This is it. This is her official. This is her official webpage. For Greta Thunberg, things are a little bit different. These are the ways in which she communicated in the last few days. You can see a reference to a cyclone in Bengal in India, the most intense category 5 cyclone on record. And then if we go down a few days ago, there's more of the same issue. We can scroll down a little bit. We see photos, etc. But she seems to continue what she has been doing for so long. This is her 91st week into the strike. And if we go down a little bit, we are going to see that this is yet another issue that she's quite familiar with. Industrial animal farming has caused most new infectious diseases and risk for more pandemics. And then finally, an issue from the BBC, which has to do with deforestation in Brazil. Now, let's go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so here in the PowerPoint, you see how she has been dealing, or perhaps not dealing so often with COVID, at least in the last 10, 15 days, contrary to Extinction Rebellion. And here, I would like to conclude making yet another point and drawing on your attention on the ways in which the UNICEF, so one of the UN agencies, has been coping with COVID-19 and at the same time integrating or turning Greta Thunberg in one of the items that UNICEF uses to discuss coronavirus. If we go on the webpage of UNICEF, here we are. If we do the same, we scroll down. This is a dedicated page of UNICEF to COVID crisis. If we scroll down a little, we are going to see how all the activities of UNICEF that related to the protection of children are discussed here in connection with the coronavirus. And here, rather on the left, you see Greta Thunberg and the quote, "Let's move humanity for children and fight coronavirus." So Greta Thunberg becomes part of a broader campaign by UNICEF. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. And the long quote that you can read later on has to do with the official message that we find on the website of UNICEF. Now, without further ado, let me introduce my colleague, Christophe Lécureuil, who is in charge with me of the certificate in advocacy here at the Graduate Institute. I turn the floor and the remote control to you, Christophe.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. The purpose of this next session is not to give brownie points or not to give red cards to any organizations, but it's pretty much to look at how these organizations responded to the current crisis. So to start really with the one that is at the center of this crisis, the World Health Organization, you have to admit it's a tough business for them to communicate, advocate, and react. So they're obviously under immense pressure to communicate on a daily basis with their daily briefings. They've got, I must admit, very good spokespeople. And also you've realized that they needed to react day in, day out to member states having fights, to rumors, to new development in science, in data, which might explain sometimes, why you see on the 24th of April and 14th of May, messages that you feel may not be very consistent, but in fact they have to deal with, something which is ongoing every day. So, so tough job, because consistency in a crisis is usually what is recommended, but you have to deal with the external environment, obviously. If you look at other organizations, that's quite interesting. Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and it's their core business, vaccination, right? So they're in the middle of it. And they did a sort of scaled approach to communication. The first one was really around benefits of vaccination, when we started talking about, should a vaccine be soon available. Then they moved on to how they could help in low-income countries around vaccination for that, that purpose. They went on to the fundraising. I think they're in the middle of the replenishment at the moment. So there was a great platform to talk to donors. And then now we see they're in the middle with other organizations of the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator. So really in the middle of it, focused on vaccination, that's their core business. Another interesting set of organizations are the pharmaceutical companies and industries, obviously. So here on the left side, you see the International Pharma Association website, on the right side, the European one. And it's interesting where you're starting to get into the trade associations, where it's quite competitive, obviously, since many of the companies are competing to produce a vaccine, right? So it makes it a bit more difficult for these type of organizations not to choose the lowest common denominator, which is talking about innovation, about collaboration, these kind of words. So it makes it a bit more difficult to be practical if information is not shared, which I doubt it isn't. The piece around this is that you're as strong as your weakest link. And we've seen a bit of a blurb into the whole thing for the pharma industry, with Sanofi announcing at one point that they would make the vaccine available only to the US market, which created, in particular in France, but elsewhere as well, I think South Africa, quite an outburst of anger. So now I think you see how far you can go and how you keep your members together in these instances. Another interesting organization in the middle of the storm are the airlines. And that was back in April. You can't see that, but basically what it says, it's a letter sent to the European Commission and member states from the associations Airlines for Europe, which represents pretty much all the airlines in Europe. And it was really focused on operations and keeping business continuity as much as possible. A lot of detailed points which are very practical, you know, should we have social distancing in planes? Can we still allow cargo planes to go, et cetera, et cetera. So very focused. And there, obviously, every airline agrees with the other airlines that that's the kind of thing that you should be doing. Interesting, I don't know if you've read a couple of days ago, the CEO from Ryanair now is distancing himself from the other airlines because a lot of governments are talking about bailouts, subsidies to save these airlines, which are in very difficult times. So is that the beginning of the end of that cohesion? We'll see. The other piece that I looked at was the food industry. Again, at the center, was one of the elements of people getting together virtually, really getting your food in your plate was important. And the European food industry did an interesting advocacy campaign called Food Heroes that was quite visible. I'm not saying it was successful, but it was quite visible and well taken up by their members, national associations, but also by the companies themselves. Everybody used that Food Heroes. And what was interesting is that the underlying messages was, of course, you celebrate that food is coming onto your plate, that people are delivering food in supermarkets, etc. So you had that human element. And then from the policy elements, they were focusing on, EU agriculture, let's support it, farm to fork, the European single market, let's keep it open. So there were also political message hidden into those more popular type of approaches. So as I said, I mean, we can go on the list of hundreds of organizations having communicated during this crisis. There's no good or bad. That was not the intention. I think every organization is trying, according to their own internal and external pressures that they have, to communicate the best they can, and they have to make choices, right? And then it's us as consumers or as policymakers to make a judgment on that. So before concluding, I wanted to check one thing, which is who should we trust? Whoever we are, politicians, citizens, moms, who do we trust? And that slide shows a survey done end of March or early March, I think early March, by Edelman, the PR agency. And they were asking, who are the trusted spokespeople for this crisis? And there are 4 buckets really in there. The first bucket, those who are most trusted, scientists, doctors, the World Health Organization's experts, right? So that gives you some idea if you are in an organization, should you, use these spokespeople for your points. The second set, relatively well trusted, are NGOs, your employer, so that's an interesting point, and your colleagues. Yeah? So there's a whole notion of internal communication. How can you, use this as a platform? The third bucket, where it's more divisive, is really government leaders of your country. So also this is interesting. I mean, there's been, I come from France, there's been quite a lot of criticism around that with not knowing what was exactly the right strategy. So you see that this is more divisive. And then interestingly, that's where we get our news from a lot, is media and journalists are the least trusted institutions around that outbreak. So that gives you an idea. This is not scientific, but that gives an idea. Obviously, we should probably have a look at the next piece of research on that to see if the evolution has moved one way or another. To conclude on that side, some key learnings from an advocacy perspective, since this is what we're here for. The messaging. Clearly, organizations, we've seen that with Davide's examples, they need to be relevant on that issue. They need to be clear, they need to be consistent, and they need to be practical. The audiences, you can see that there's a refocus of these organizations to refocus on who really matters to them, It might be different, might be your employees, might be your customers, might be your suppliers, governments, the general public, whoever, but you need to refocus on your core audiences. Then it's interesting to see who have you put forward as your spokespeople and are they trustworthy? And that's something that you need to reflect at as an institution. Is that your CEO, are these experts, are these your employees, your peers, whoever? And then we've seen there are multiple strategies available, right? Some piggyback on the crisis. They want to sell more products, they want to restore the operations, they want to advocate for their cause using COVID-19 as the hook. Might be e-commerce, might be air travel, might be non-communicable diseases, might be climate change activists. Some others are using a sort of leadership approach, which means they take a stance and they say they bring our expertise, our products to help solve the problem, and we're not asking anything in return. And have a look, you know, at the tech industry, have a look at the alcohol industry, which switched production from alcohol to hand sanitizers, for example. The third one was the mission-driven, as I mentioned, the example of Gavi, where you want to become central as an organization or an institution during that crisis, incontournable in French. Then there are the competitive sets, and which are focused on the market. You still want to be, you know, the first on the market. Then you've got the sort of opportunity to reposition your industry. If you've been under some kind of criticism or a bit of pressure, then you can turn yourself into the, you know, celebrating the hero. And that's probably the examples of the food and the pharma. And then the last one, which is a bit more the old-fashioned way, would be the corporate social responsibility, philanthropy-driven type of approach, where you give products, you know, to health workers, where you give cash donations, etc., etc. So this was our last slide. Welcome back, Davide, here.
Thank you. And, thank you, Christophe. So now we're going to open up the floor for questions, answers, and we're going to engage with them, answer to them, and there will be a final moment for all of you to engage with more practical questions related to our module. So the floor is open. While waiting, I will take this opportunity to remind all of you that we're going to teach on these and many other issues related to the pharma business, public health, global health, or the food industry, and the issue of human rights, climate change, humanitarianism from different disciplinary perspectives. The disciplines that we do teach at the Graduate Institute: international law, economics, anthropology, sociology, history, political science, and international relations. And we're going to invite guest speakers who often are practitioners, are advocates themselves, and have an awful lot of experience, and they can share what they have experienced, not really or not only with respect to the COVID-19, but with many other issues. And this is what we're going to do in the modules of our certificate. I can read some questions. So Rebecca asks, wouldn't you say that not acknowledging COVID-19 in your communication as a private company would be a commercial suicide, given how many people are affected?
I would say it would not be very smart, because that's what everybody is thinking about. I mean, it affects our personal lives, which is rare for a crisis. So it affects all of us. So I say that would not be very smart not to acknowledge it one way or another.
And then we have a second question by Parida with regards to the study and observations on lesser trust with media and journalists. So what comment and advocacy you wish to launch? I can take this one. Personally, I do not wish to launch a kind of advocacy. I would like advocates to be more aware and to be sharp enough to realize the context in which they are operating. And so this is the way I would like to advocates to react or to respond, since this was one of the key terms that we use today to crises like the COVID and many others. I don't know if you want to add.
Nothing to add.
Jean-Yves Clemenceau, sorry, okay. Good morning, David and Christophe. Do you think that NGOs have generally overstated the crisis or underplayed it? Well, those that I'm familiar with from the human rights, humanitarian, public health sector, I would tend to say that many of them were absolutely aware of the importance of the COVID. The vast majority of them have not underplayed, understated, or ignored the seriousness of this particular crisis. Some of them have been fast, and this was the example from Extinction Rebellion, to integrate the COVID-19 in their activities. Maybe you can tell me this was an easy things to do for this particular NGO, and this is something which is objectively more difficult to do for other institutions, for other NGOs. If I think about NGOs like Médecins Sans Frontières, for instance, I think they have been extremely careful, extremely aware of the situations, and they've been playing their role in different countries. If I think about what they've been doing with autochthonous populations in the USA, or what they've been doing here in Switzerland, I think that they have certainly not ignored the issue and have not overstated it, but they reacted in a very balanced, mature, and responsible way. Massimo, thank you for your presentation. I would like to ask you a question about shrinking space of civil society in being a credible and legitimate voice in public debates. How COVID is impacting this?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I can only answer from a sort of personal reference point, since I was confined like everybody else in France for 2 months. And there was this debate around the lack of voice for the citizens, because every law was basically taken almost by decree. There was no debate in Parliament, and then the CSOs, the civil society organizations, had no real voice into this. So I haven't looked at other countries, might be similar, but at least in where I stood during that moment, you could feel that.
One of the things that we are going to examine, and just to continue my reply to this particular question, one of the things that we're going to examine in our modules is precisely this idea of shrinking spaces, expanding spaces. I do believe that in many respects, there is very strong evidence that the civil space, or the space for civil society and grassroots movements is shrinking. But we should not underestimate the creativity and the ability of these movements to find new spaces. So on the one hand, there is a very strong argument for the ideas of a shrinking space, which as specialists or scholars we should engage with. But at the same time, we would like to draw the attention of our participants on the possibilities of expanding other spaces. And we use the image of the spongy as a way of thinking about the shrinking and expanding and expansion of spaces. But the question is an excellent one that would deserve much more time to be engaged with thoroughly. How can, so this is Shiraz, sorry, the video is a bit far away. Shiraz, how can an industry communicate about this support, commitment, donations, etc., without being accused of COVID washing?
I guess you've got to be transparent and you've got to be honest. Sometimes you have to acknowledge also that you don't have all the answers, but that you're doing your best with the knowledge that you have and with the outside experts that you're speaking to, that you're doing the right thing. And if you can't say more or do more, stick to this, but don't invent anything.
Yes, we do see that there are questions on the chat and question on the question and answer. We're going to move, continue with the question and answer, and then we're going to address the questions in the chat, okay? So we have a question from Mamadou. Multilateralism is under attack during this crisis. How best can we advocate for more solidarity and global responses to this crisis? It is true, and particularly in Geneva, this is one of the discourses that we hear the most. Multilateralism is under attack. At the same time, just like a little bit like the answer I gave your colleague before, I am also persuaded that there are many other ways in which multilateralism thrives. And it thrives precisely thanks to civil society, thanks to non-state actors, and on some occasions also thanks to the private sector and the way in which it interacts with state actors and intergovernmental organizations. So it is true that it is under attack, but advocacy and this particular issue of solidarity and coordinated global responses has to come, in my view, precisely from this kind of activity and this coordination among civil society movement, which have to act transnationally.
It is true that at this moment, what happened is there's a sort of renationalization of politics, international level, European level. But so that means your advocacy also has to, to switch, probably for a period, and then you will rebalance that with the multilateral organization. Give you an example. The WHO, I think yesterday or this morning, adopted that resolution to have that independent review of how the WHO reacted, linked to the US attacking the work of WHO. I think it was led by the EU. So, if you want to make sure that as an advocate, the WHO is trusted, then you go and see a number of influential member states, and during the assembly, you get them to support that. So it becomes a tactical element, if you will.
Mm-hmm. There are two questions on the WHO. One is, what do you think about the activity of the WHO during the pandemic? And the other one on the chat is, what is your opinion of the WHO communication since the outset of the virus? And then there is a sub question on China. Would you like to engage on this one?
Yep. So on the first point around around the activity of WHO, you have to acknowledge that it's an organization that is driven by the member states, right? So they can only advise, make recommendations, put out posters, warn countries that what might happen if they don't do anything. So, and then it's up to individual countries to accept this advice or not. So there are institutional limitations to this. It's not a supranational government, right? On their communication, I've been relatively impressed, I must say, because I'm almost falling, sorry, because they were under immense pressure to react to anything. I was watching checking their website yesterday, and they had to react to issues like, should you drink bleach? Yeah. Yes. Should you go under the sun? So they had to deal with serious stuff and less serious stuff. So it was, so they did, the best they could, I think, and they did well.
Okay, we have more questions. So can you identify coherence of any aspects regarding RCA, strategies across governments and international institutions?
What is RCA?
What is our RCA? Can you tell us, Heidi? And in the meantime, we're going to take another question relating to your presentation. How have organizations and governments performed with risk communication and damage control as it applies to WHO and national governments? This is to answer to this question properly, it would take an awful lot of time. What we can tell you is that the way we proceed in our classes, in our module, is precisely not to judge, but try and understand. This is the posture that we do take. And one of the ways that we intend to tackle the question that you're asking is precisely to compare and contrast. Now, Christophe was referring to the very high level of criticism that has taken place and we have read about in France. If we compare and contrast with the case of Switzerland, Germany, and Austria, three countries that are in Western Europe, more or less at the same latitude, well, things are very, very different. Generally speaking, the population has been, in Switzerland, for instance, has been relatively positive and persuaded and convinced by the way the Swiss government has decided to communicate. And the way the Swiss government has communicated was not too often, very short communication, very simple, very clear, and not systematic, which was very different from the ways in which, for instance, the Italian government or the Spanish government have gone about communicating on the decision taken by each respective government.
I think it's an important point that you're making, and I don't have the answer, but communication once a week in Switzerland was short, clear, and making proper decisions and announcements. And when they didn't know, they said they didn't know. In some other countries where there was a daily briefing, it got people really anxious, and sometimes you have nothing new to say, right? Apart from reporting new deaths. So is it better to communicate once a day and be fully transparent, or is it better to take your time and communicate every other day, every week? I don't know, but the impact on the population seemed to have been different.
We have a question from Fologo on the chat. Thanks for your presentation. Thank you. How do you have focused and relevant messaging when the crises are very fast-moving development and never experienced before? This is an excellent point. And of course, as experts and scholars, this is very difficult because, as you say, this is a moving target. So, you know, historians at least are like pathologists. We like to undertake our analysis when the corpse is not moving anymore. So nothing is happening, and then it's easier to assess. It is easier to offer analysis. In this particular case, I took the risk of talking about an ongoing campaign of Extinction Rebellion, or the ways in which Greta Thunberg decided to communicate or not on COVID, taking some risks. So I know for a fact that my analysis is incomplete, it is partial, will need more time to be developed in a more thoroughly way, but at the same time, if we shy away from engaging when situations like COVID-19 happen, I think we would act in a very irresponsible way as scholars. Mm-hmm. So I do prefer to take the risk.
And my answer to this question would be, well, be prepared for the worst. And every organization should seriously have a crisis plan, not only for COVID, should have had, because you know, these kind of issues and crises happen, and we know they will happen, and we know others will happen. So I encourage every organization to thoroughly review its crisis plan and have them in place.
We have a question from Anurag, a long one, but we're going to take it all the same. It is said that the worst of times brings out the best in people. As it happens, this is true of organizations as well, I think. Of course, some of these outcomes might simply be from organizational adrenaline, heroic efforts that are unsustainable. We know that many people are working harder than ever and risk suffering fatigue and burnout. However, one also sees signs that the opposite is happening. Amid the fear and uncertainty, people are energized as companies make good on purpose statements, eliminate bureaucracy, etc. So this is just helping advocacy at its fundamental levels. Yes, the question is long, but the question is very good. And it brings us into a terrain that we intend to explore in our module. So how a given institution in times of crisis responds. And very often you will see that some of them completely collapse. Others are absolutely reinvigorated. Others find purpose, and probably the best comes out in these times. And there again, the posture that we have is not the one of judging, but it's really the one of understanding what is happening. And so when we look closer or close enough, and we open the box of what is happening within these institutions, we will be able to examine the dynamics or the mechanics that allow for one of these best intentions to thrive, or simply not to exist.
Nothing to add.
Okay. We're going to go back to the question and answers, and the first one is, okay, we're going to back to the RCA, risk communication. Sorry, it has a slip, okay. So she was referring to our risk communication.
Okay.
Accidents.
What's the question? Because I don't have my glasses.
Can you identify coherence of any aspects regarding the risk communication accident strategies across governments and international institutions?
That would take half a day probably to jointly answer that. But yes, you can see patterns of responses. Some of them, some organizations being very proactive with their employees, with their customers, with the external stakeholders. Some others probably taking a more, not relaxed, but backseat type of approach, making sure kind of business continuity is the priority. And some others probably trying to say, I can help, yeah? What can I do to help? So there are different strategies, and obviously according to the strategies, the messages are different.
I think we've engaged with Eric's question, which was a comparison and contrast of several governments and how they communicated on COVID. And we can move to the next one by Isabel. How do you evaluate WHO communication crisis strategy along this pandemic? I think we've answered to a very similar question. And then, do you think that the strategies put in place by organizations you have mentioned on the last slide can be combined? How much do you think the pharma industry perceive the risk and will change?
It's a difficult question. Is your question really, how much do you think the pharma industry perceive the risk? Which risk? The risk to their business, the risk to society? So I don't know which risk you are talking about. I think they're fully aware, obviously, of the crisis. I think they have the competitive limitations. This is an extremely competitive industry. I mean, if you look at the business of market access that is putting drugs on the market, it's a long process. It's a lot of R&D work before you do this. So imagine the sort of speed that they have to go through now to produce the vaccine, test it, and kind of make sure it goes to everybody. So it's complex. I think they're trying to do the best they can to be good citizens, but there are market forces here that we're not fully aware of.
Okay. How do you protect your brand, service company with public contacts, reputation, who may potentially cause a spread, even one case, due to an inadvertent breach, for instance, some personnel being asymptomatic, of local health and safety protocols? I'm not a specialist on this one, so I cannot say, but if I go back to what we know a little bit better, and so advocacy, obviously the ways in which companies or even NGOs or intergovernmental organizations or governments cope well or badly with this particular question is going to affect the ways, their credibility, no matter what, in the future. So I know for sure, I know for a fact that so many of them, big and small, have been taking exactly the point that you're making very seriously, precisely because of the consequences that not doing that might have on their other activities. Who do you think won the communication battle at the online World Health Assembly yesterday?
Do you have a view?
No.
I don't want to be a judge, as Davide saw, and I think we need to review the result. I think, you know, at least what I read, because that's also what you read, right? So for me, I checked that out on Twitter. So that was my news feed to understand what was going on. And I felt that the EU actually came out pretty strong into this as a sort of proponent, for example, of that independent review. So one example, I mean, I haven't done the full review, but at least that's what I read.
I think that there are people that have considered, you know, the WHO doomed or already a zombie. And I would be more cautious and suspend any kind of rush judgment on what is going to happen to the World Health Organization. So this is not really related to your question, but it's a broader point. And this is also something that we do care about saying about the ways in which we do work here. As much as we engage with current issues, as much as we need to be very, very cautious, precisely because these issues are not settled yet. There are still targets that move and are alive and kicking, and so we better be very, very, very cautious before pronouncing ourselves. I think there are more questions on the WHO, and this is absolutely understandable. by Peter, there is a very coordinated effort among the White House and their allies. I would like to know more about their allies, to try to find scapegoats for the fatal mistakes that the president made during the early stage of this virus crisis. How do you assess WHO's performance in the pandemic communication to date? Are there things it could have done better to neutralize this chit for chat activity?
I think we sort of answered that. They didn't have the luxury to put strategies in place to defeat one member state or more were trying to discredit their work. But my general advice is coalition building. And that's, I think, what they did during this week. If you build a coalition when you're under attack, that's the best way to counter that attack.
Okay, let's move to the chat board because there are questions over there too. I have a question by Galia. In order to remain trustworthy, how can we deal with misinformation from the government when the survey you showed are more trusted than journalists, and then journalists having other information?
Mm-hmm. How do you deal with misinformation? Well, there are different approaches. I mean, you can use, you can discredit misinformation by making it laughable or humorous, or you can make sure that you have super strong backup data on the other side. And there's probably a range of actions that you can take in between. I mean, the issue of trust with journalism is not due to this crisis. It's been going on for a number of years now, for a number of reasons that, some media outlets are now owned by private sector companies. So there are influences. Probably the profession of journalism has evolved as well. You are fast moving. Davide was referring to this. If you constantly on the quick move to produce that story, maybe you don't have the time to do the normal checks that you would do normally in that profession. So there are many, many factors.
Mm-hmm. But precisely one of the things that we would like to discuss with the participants of our modules and the certificate in international advocacy is precisely to invite you all to take a different stance when it comes to analysis. Probably because we live in Geneva and we are very often pressured into this response, rapid response logic, just like as if we were humanitarians. We're not humanitarians. Humanitarians have a duty to respond very fast to an earthquake or a conflict. But here, we are in a different setting. Of course, we do understand that in your professional context, you are forced to do exactly the same, to respond very, very fast. But here, this is a time that we want to take for all of you and all of us to think differently, to take the time to analyze things calmly and to take into consideration different perspectives. And once in a while, this is very, very useful, especially for professionals that have this kind of pressure. And this is what we would like to add to the reflection that you might do in the future. So there are more questions. I see that it's 1:20. We're going to take 3 or 4 questions, and then we're going to turn the floor to Guillemette for a conclusion. Diane asks, any reflections on how to respond to the spread of misinformation on COVID, groups that are spreading misinformation for their own interest, and how best to stop the spread? Well, partially, I answered to your question by saying that the fake news are absolutely nothing new. I mean, we do talk a lot about them today, but we could show you evidence that there is practically nothing new under the sun. There are ways in which we can verify, corroborate, or contest the contents of misinformation. And this is precisely by cross-referencing. This is precisely taking on board different perspectives. And this is definitely very, very important. This is even more important during time of crisis, especially the COVID-19 crisis. So this is exactly the spirit that animate us, and this is exactly how we intend to proceed in our certificate. Okay. Dominic, yes. Thanks for your presentation. How should or could the WHO communicate consistently as, in addition to the health crisis, there is an organizational crisis with sustained attacks on the legitimacy and the work done by the WHO? How can an organization like the WHO protect its reputation and legitimacy through crisis communication?
Well, I think they sort of have, in a sense, because they never gave up. And they didn't fight back face to face, because you can't fight, you know, a member, one of your important member states. But I think they did it smart way. They've used third-party experts, which also refers to the question before around how do you, fight misinformation. Well, third-party expert in advocacy is always an important tactic to use if you don't want to go frontal. So, they've done what they could. And don't forget that the science has been evolving every day, right? So, in a sense, they've managed that sometimes lack of proper information pretty well, and sometimes they were in advance. I mean, I think one of their spokespeople, Dr. Ryan, I think, he was quite good in foresight and advising in advance. So I think we shouldn't judge only by what we hear from some member states or some organizations that are saying that they've done the wrong job. I mean, we have to sit down and look at the evidence.
Absolutely. I'm afraid this is all we have time for, and I scrolling down the questions answered, there are so many interesting questions that we would have loved to engage with. We're really sorry we cannot do it today. Allow us to conclude by stating a few things that seem so important to us. Well, the issue of responding, the response. This was central to our presentation today. How do advocacy or advocates or institutions that are involved with advocacy and communication in a way or in another have responded or still are responding to the COVID crisis? We have deconstructed the term crisis just a little bit because we do think that this is very important. This is something crucial. We have engaged with the spatial temporal dimensions, and we put forward a number of examples. And these are the kind of things that we're going to do in our certificate. So if you are interested, just contact one of us, or please do contact Guillemette. Christophe.
Now, just to add that in Module 2, we're going to have a dedicated session on crisis anticipation and crisis management. Okay.
And we're going to turn the floor to Guillemette now. She's going to give you some further information concerning the module. This is all from us. We say goodbye, and we invite Guillemette in. Guillemette.
So if you want to learn more, we invite you to join our executive programs on advocacy in international affairs. The programs are offered in two formats, two types of degrees. You can either follow an executive certificate, which will bring you 15 credits. To do that, you will have to follow two modules. Module 1, from the 3rd to the 11th of June 2020, which will be a live virtual classroom. And Module 2, 26th of August to 3rd of September in Geneva. And then to receive an executive master, 30 credits, you will have to follow two additional modules. Module 3 from 7 September to 23 of October online. And then module 4, 17 to 27 of November in Geneva. If you have any questions about our programs, please don't hesitate to contact me. You will have the details on this slide. You have my email address, phone number, and the address of the website. And I will be very pleased to send you this information by email after this webinar. Without further ado, we thank you very much for joining us today, and we wish you a very nice afternoon. Thank you.